Welcome, fellow knowledge seekers, to another custom-tailored deep dive. Have you ever stopped and wondered about where, extraordinary human abilities really come from? Or maybe thought about those phenomena we often just label as supernatural? If there's something more going on? What if there was a single scientific idea, a hypothesis, that could actually explain almost everything? Genius, faith healing, math prodigies, even ghosts. Well, today we're plunging into a really fascinating text from the turn of the century. It's Thomson Jay Hudson's The Law of Psychic Phenomena, published way back in 1893. Now, Hudson, he had a PhD in LLD. He set it with this, pretty audacious goal. He wanted to create a working hypothesis that could cover all psychic stuff, simplify it, connect the dots, and maybe, just maybe, pull it out of the supernatural realm altogether, put it under natural law. So our mission today, let's unpack Hudson's claims, look at the evidence he uses, which is surprisingly interesting, and uncover his conclusions about the mind. They sound quite modern, actually. Get ready, because this deep dive might just challenge a few things you thought you knew.
It's kind of a unified theory attempt. Okay, so let's dig in. Hudson's whole system basically hinges on one big idea, that man has T2O minds, foundational stuff. Can you walk us through what he meant by these objective and subjective minds?
Absolutely. So the objective mind for Hudson is pretty straightforward. It's our conscious mind, the one dealing with the outside world. It gets information through the five senses, sight, sound, touch.
Our everyday awareness.
Exactly. It guides us physically, and crucially, it uses inductive reasoning.
Inductive. So gathering facts to build up a general idea.
Precisely. Observing specifics, forming principles, empirical, learning piece by piece from the world. Then there's the subjective mind. And this is where it gets, a lot more interesting, maybe a bit mysterious. Hudson says it's the seat of our emotions, and importantly, our memory. But here's the twist. It cannot reason inductively. It can't look at a bunch of facts and figure out the general rule on its own.
Okay, so how does it reason then?
Deductively. Give it any premise, any starting point, doesn't matter how wild it seems to the objective mind, and it reasons from that premise with incredible logic and power. Flawless deduction, just based on whatever it's told.
Yep.
And the memory part. Hudson claims it's perfect. It remembers everything, every experience, every bit of knowledge, every impression, even things our objective mind has completely forgotten.
Perfect memory.
Yeah.
That's huge. Even for things we don't remember remembering. Does he give solid examples of that? Because that sounds almost unbelievable.
He does, and they are pretty striking. There's the famous case of the Countess de Laval. Apparently when she was in a certain state, like sleep, she started speaking fluent
Breton, the language.
Yeah, a language she knew as a baby, living in Brittany, but hadn't spoken or thought about in decades. Objectively forgotten. But her subjective mind, it held on to it perfectly. Another one he mentions is this illiterate servant girl. During a fever, she starts reciting whole pages of Greek and Hebrew perfectly.
Literate.
Turns out, years before, she'd lived with an old pastor who used to read those texts aloud. She wasn't learning them objectively, but her subjective mind recorded it all, word for word.
That's genuinely mind-blowing. Okay, so this subjective mind is this incredible memory bank, super logical deductively. But here's the kicker you mentioned. Hudson says it's constantly amenable to the power of suggestion. What does that mean for us? How does that influence things?
It means it's incredibly receptive, almost you could say gullible from the objective standpoint. The law of suggestion is central here. Hudson states the subjective mind accepts, basically without question, any statement given to it. Doesn't matter how absurd it seems to our logical, objective mind.
Any statement, really.
Yeah, he gives these classic hypnotism examples. Tell someone they're a dog, they'll start acting like one, barking, crawling as much as they physically can. Tell them they're the president, they adopt the persona, the dignity, everything with amazing accuracy.
So the belief just takes over.
Completely.
Yeah.
He even mentions suggesting water is brandy and the person gets intoxicated. Or suggesting brandy is medicine and it sobers them up. The subjective mind believes the suggestion and the body follows.
Okay, that's powerful. But what about suggestions we give ourselves? Does that work the same way?
Yes, that's what he calls autosuggestion. And it's just as powerful, often more so. This is when the subjective mind is influenced by ideas or beliefs coming from the person's own objective mind. It can be conscious, like positive affirmations, or unconscious, like deeply held beliefs or fears.
So our own thoughts are constantly programming our subjective mind.
Pretty much. He points out that even in hypnotism, if you suggest something that violates a person's core principles, like telling a teetotaler to drink alcohol, their internal autosuggestion, their own belief system, will often cause them to resist or even wake up.
Interesting. So there's a protective element there based on our own ingrained beliefs.
Exactly. The auto-suggestion of their own principles overrides the external one.
It really makes you think, doesn't it? This duality, this powerful subjective mind just waiting for instructions, whether from outside or from our own thoughts. It kind of shapes our whole experience. Okay, let's shift gears a little. How does this dual mind idea apply to something like genius? Hudson uses figures like Napoleon, Shakespeare. What's his take there?
Right. For Hudson, true genius isn't just, high IQ or talent. It's something more specific. He defines it as the synchronous, harmonious action of both minds working together, perfectly aligned.
Synchronous action.
Yeah, so you have the objective mind's reasoning power, its ability to analyze the real world, combined with the subjective mind's perfect memory and its incredible deductive ability, all firing together harmoniously.
So it's like having the best of both worlds operating at peak efficiency.
Exactly. He even references Macaulay's description of poets having this frenzy. Macaulay said their reasonings are just, but the premises are false. Hudson connects that directly to the subjective mind. Perfect deduction, flawless logic, but maybe starting from a premise that isn't objectively true, which can look like madness or, poetic inspiration.
The figures like Napoleon or Shakespeare.
He sees them as prime examples. Napoleon's strategic insight, almost intuitive grasp of battlefields. Shakespeare's deep understanding of human nature, his command of language. Hudson argues that's the dual mind in perfect or near perfect harmony.
So genius isn't just raw talent, it's this internal alignment. That's a fascinating way to think about it. It implies maybe it's something you could cultivate.
That seems to be the implication, yeah. Understanding how to get these two parts talking to each other effectively.
Okay, but it's not just the historical giants. He also talks about prodigies, right? Like mathematical whizzes, musical talents, Zira Colburn, Blind Tom. What do they show us?
They show the subjective mind's power operating almost independently of objective learning. Zira Colburn, this kid, he could solve incredibly complex math problems.
Like what?
Like calculate the cube root of a massive number instantly, or figure out 8 to the power of 16, stuff way beyond his age or education. And he apparently had no idea how he did it. The answer just appeared.
Wow. So intuitive math.
That's how Hudson interprets it. The subjective mind grasping the underlying mathematical laws directly without needing objective teaching. And then there's Blind Tom. Blind, considered intellectually limited in objective terms, but a musical marvel.
What could he do?
Hear a complex piece of music, like an opera selection, just once, and reproduce it perfectly on the piano. He understood harmony intuitively, again, with no formal musical education.
Incredible.
Hudson uses them to hammer home the point. The subjective mind has this amazing memory and an inherent grasp of natural laws, totally separate from what the objective mind learns through schooling or experience.
It really makes you wonder about potential, doesn't it? Maybe these extraordinary talents aren't so much gifts from outside, but inherent powers of this subjective mind, just needing the right conditions to emerge. It flips the script on innate ability versus learned skill. Okay, let's pivot to healing. Hudson brings his theory into mental therapeutics. This covers faith healing, stuff that sounds a bit like Christian Science. How does he explain healing using the dual mind? He's trying to make it scientific, right?
Absolutely. His core principle here is that the subjective mind has absolute control over the body. Functions, conditions, sensations, everything.
Complete control.
That's his assertion. Therefore, if the therapeutic suggestion, like you are healthy or the pain is gone, is truly accepted by the subjective mind, it can direct the body to restore health.
So the belief makes it real, physically.
Essentially, yes. He uses Christian Science as an example. Objectively, denying the existence of matter or disease might seem absurd. But Hudson argues its success isn't about the objective truth of its claims.
It's about
the patient's subjective mind believing in the effectiveness of the method. The suggestion is accepted, and the subjective mind controlling the body acts on that belief.
That's quite a take. What about things like healing from a distance? Or healing someone while they sleep?
Yeah, he talks about absent treatment and healing during natural sleep. He thinks sleep is actually the ideal time for this.
Why sleep?
Because the objective mind is passive, quiet, it's not resisting or doubting. So he suggests telepathic suggestions can reach the patient's subjective mind more easily and be accepted.
Telepathic suggestion, so mind to mind.
That's the implication. And he even adds this interesting bit. He says it reacts favorably upon the healer, too. It's twice blessed, helping both the person being healed and the person doing the healing.
A kind of positive feedback loop.
Interesting. Okay, so if suggestion is so central, how did Hudson view the big debates happening in hypnotism back then? You had the Paris school, the Nancy school, the mesmerists. Where did he fit in? He definitely sided with the Nancy school. Their big thing was that suggestion was the key factor in hypnosis, and it worked perfectly well on healthy people.
Right, and the Paris school.
They saw hypnotism more as a pathology, a symptom of a diseased nervous system. They thought only hysterics or neurotics could be properly hypnotized. Hudson strongly disagreed with that.
Okay, and Mesmer, with his animal magnetism. That sounds more mystical.
Right, Mesmer talked about this invisible fluid. Hudson offered a different explanation. He thought Mesmer and his followers, through their intense concentration and physical passes, were essentially hypnotizing themselves.
Hypnotizing themselves? How?
Inducing a state where their own subjective minds could establish a telepathic rapport with the subject. It wasn't a fluid, it was this subjective connection that allowed their suggestions to influence the patient.
Ah, so it's still suggestion, just maybe facilitated by the operator's own mental state.
Exactly. And he made a distinction with animals, too. He separated mesmerization of animals, like staring down a wild beast to make it docile, which he saw as influencing its will, from hypnotization of animals, like making a chicken passive by holding its head down, which he saw as purely physiological reflexes.
So, different mechanisms at play. It really underscores how powerful belief and suggestion are thought to be, affecting even our physical state, maybe without us even realizing it. And it puts those historical debates in a new light. Okay, let's wade into the really deep end now. Spiritism. Things like slate writing, mediums channeling spirits, automatic writing, clairvoyance, even ghosts. This is classic supernatural territory. How does Hudson tackle this?
He tackles it head-on with the same framework. His core argument is pretty radical for the time, and maybe even now. He argues that all these spiritistic phenomena are products of the subjective mind of the living person involved, the medium, the percipient, whoever. They're controlled by suggestion, either spoken or telepathic. They are not communications from disembodied spirits.
So, no ghosts, no spirits talking through mediums. It's all coming from the medium themselves.
That's his position. He explains why mediums often fail when skeptics are present. The skeptic's strong disbelief acts as a powerful countersuggestion to the medium's subjective mind, basically telling it, this is impossible, which then blocks any phenomena.
Okay, that makes a certain kind of sense within his system. What about things like getting messages seemingly from the dead, like on slates?
He uses logic there.
Correct.
He points out that mediums could sometimes get messages seemingly directed to living people using the same methods. If the source is the same for messages to the living and the dead, he argues, then none of it can actually be from spirits. It must all originate from the medium's subjective mind, accessing its vast memory, or perhaps telepathically reading the minds of those present.
So, clairvoyance, telepathy, those are just subjective mind powers.
Yes, inherent abilities of the subjective mind, not spirit communication. He talks about experiments where someone clearly read information directly from an other living person's mind.
In automatic writing, like when someone writes stuff, that doesn't seem like them.
Same principle. He mentions a case of a young woman writing detailed messages, supposedly from Henry Morton, who turned out to be a character in a play she'd seen. Her subjective mind accepted the suggestion of this persona, or trance visions, like someone seeing a figure they interpret as God. It's the subjective mind acting out internal beliefs or external suggestions.
Okay, connecting this up, what about actual ghosts? Haunted houses, the really spooky stuff. Does he just dismiss it?
No, he doesn't dismiss the experience, but he explains it differently. For Hudson, ghosts aren't souls. They are phantasms, or, get this, embodied thoughts.
Embodied thoughts.
Yeah, created by the intense energy of a subjective mind, either a living person under extreme stress, or perhaps someone recently deceased, especially if they died violently, like in a murder. Their subjective mind, in that intense moment, projects a powerful mental image.
So it's like a psychic echo.
Kind of. And crucially, he says these phantasms have no general intelligence. They just replay the dominant thought or emotion that created them, like walking a certain path or repeating an action. They aren't the conscious soul.
And they can disappear.
He notes they often do when their perceived mission is done, like if a crime is revealed or if the physical location is significantly changed or destroyed, the psychic imprint fades.
Wow. That is a completely rational, if startling, explanation for things that have scared people for ages. It really brings it back to the power and maybe the strangeness of our own minds. Taking this framework even further, Hudson applies it to really profound areas, like the figure of Christ and the nature of the soul itself.
Yeah.
How does he explain Christ's healings and spiritual understanding scientifically?
He argues Christ's abilities weren't supernatural miracles, but demonstrations of a perfect understanding and application of the natural law of suggestion and mental therapeutics.
So Christ was a master psychologist, essentially.
A master of these mental laws, yes. He analyzes the healing of Jairus' daughter, for instance. Jesus clears the room of doubters, eliminating negative suggestion. He says, "She sleepeth," not "she is dead," a powerful, positive suggestion. Hudson sees these as scientifically precise steps to create the ideal mental state for the subjective mind to restore life.
He's reading it as technique, not miracle.
Exactly. And he looks at Christ's life, like resisting the temptations in the wilderness, as proof of his objective mind having perfect control over his incredibly powerful subjective abilities. He argues Christ only used these powers for their legitimate domain, healing, preserving life, never for personal gain, showmanship, or violating natural physical laws. It was reason governing subjective power.
That's a bold interpretation. Okay, so if the subjective mind is kind of like the soul in his system, what does that mean for immortality and things like heaven and hell or rewards and punishments?
This is where suggestion becomes absolutely paramount, even for the afterlife. Hudson proposes that conscious existence after death might actually depend on your belief in immortality during life.
Seriously, belief determines consciousness after death.
That's his hypothesis. Lifelong, ingrained skepticism about the soul's survival acts as a powerful negative autosuggestion. He speculates this could lead to a kind of vegetative existence. After death, the subjective mind exists, but without consciousness because it accepted the suggestion of its own annihilation.
That's incredibly sobering.
Yeah.
What about rewards and punishments then?
He sees them as internal, experienced within the subjective mind itself. Remember, it's perfect memory. It holds every single deed, good and bad. And it has an inherent sense of justice and morality.
So, you address
In
it.
effect, yes. The subjective mind experiences the joy or remorse associated with its memories. It becomes its own heaven or hell based on the life lived and recorded. No external judge needed.
Wow. Okay. And one last big one. That universal human feeling, the impulse to worship something greater. How does Hudson fit that into his scientific framework?
He sees it as crucial evidence. He argues that this universal inherent sentiment of religious worship found in practically every normal human being must presuppose an actual object of worship capable of feeling that worship, capable of reciprocal emotion.
Like, the feeling wouldn't exist if there wasn't something real to direct it towards.
Pretty much. Just like, he says, the existence of friendship proves friends exist, or parental love proves children exist. For Hudson, this universal drive to worship is logical, scientific proof of a God of love and confirms humanity's divine origin, because nature doesn't create faculties without objects for them.
So he uses the very existence of the religious feeling as evidence for God, framed as a natural law. That's quite the conclusion to draw from his psychological model. It's a really comprehensive attempt to explain, well, almost everything. What a journey that was, huh? Right into the depths of the mind, from how we think day to day, our dual consciousness, all the way to life, death, even divinity. Hudson's working hypothesis really does try to offer one single explanation for so much.
It really does, and it's challenging, isn't it? It pushes you to look past the easy label of supernatural and consider the sheer power, often totally untapped, that might just be inside us already.
Yeah.
His whole project over 100 years ago was about bridging science and, well, spiritual understanding, wasn't it? Trying to show it could all be part of natural law.
And that really feels like the big takeaway, the incredible power of this subjective mind and how profoundly this law of suggestion seems to operate, shaping our inner and outer worlds.
Makes you really think about what suggestions are running your life, consciously or unconsciously.
Exactly. So here's something to chew on. If your subjective mind is constantly recording everything, deducing based on suggestions, and holding this perfect memory, what suggestions are you allowing to define your reality right now? And maybe even more intriguing, what incredible knowledge, skills, or memories might be locked away in there, just waiting for you to find the right key, the right suggestion to unlock them. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it's given you plenty to think about. Until next time, keep digging, keep questioning, and stay curious.
Thank you for listening to this reflection on the law of psychic phenomena by Thomson Jay Hudson. If this brought you a new perspective or moment of clarity, consider subscribing for more timeless wisdom, simplified. This is part of the Thoughts That Shape Us audiobook series, where we explore deep ideas from powerful books that still speak to the soul today. Until next time, take care of your thoughts, they shape everything.